All right, folks, we've got a first timer here. We've got a first timer on Healthcare Unfiltered. If he plays his cards right, it won't be the last time he actually comes on Healthcare Unfiltered, and he may even get a t-shirt. We'll have to negotiate that. My friend and colleague, Neal Shore, who we've known each other for several years, and we've actually met in various circles, but I'm very fortunate to have Neal on Healthcare Unfiltered. Neal, let's start by a quick introduction, a little bit about you and where you are, what you do, and how many hats are you wearing nowadays?
Well, probably too many. My wife would say that. And it's a pleasure to talk to you, Chadi. You and I have known each other, gosh, probably close to 20 years now. We've worked together on studies, on education. I've really admired your career and what you've done and how you've had a very fascinating journey. For me right now, yeah, I'm still very busy seeing my patients, having practice, doing clinical research, still operating. I'm not doing as many major operative cases as I was doing in the early part of my career, but I'm still have my hands full with clinic responsibility and research. I'm also the chief medical officer in urology and surgical oncology for Genesis Care. I still chair the educational committee for LUGPA. I'm doing a lot of work now with Specialty Network and developing their research capabilities. Love working with the SUO and the executive board as the LUGPA rep all these years. And when I'm not doing those, I'm trying to stay, active in our U.S. and our international congresses. I really love geo-oncology, and I think there's just been so many great things that have happened, not only in the last decade, but the last decade and a half, but so much so in the last 5 years, especially in bladder and kidney cancer. So it's been wonderful. I really enjoy it. We oftentimes hear about people burning out in healthcare. And I understand that, there's the burdensome challenges of regulatory and compliance and all these things. But the science and the research and the education is wonderful. And that's really what's my driving force.
What got you into urology in the first place? Something in med school? So like how were you interested in urology?
Yeah, well, I went to undergrad and med school at Duke, and I was almost about ready to do cardiovascular surgery at the time. Dr. Sabiston was the chair, and remarkably charismatic and engaging and wonderful educator and researcher and brilliant surgeon. And then I did a rotation and got to work with urologists. And I realized how much fun they are. Urologists are fun. They're surgeons, and they're also very learned about the pathophysiology of renal disease, and then also malignancies and other things non-oncologic. And I had a great mentor, a very well-renowned pediatric urologist named Lowell King. He was the chairman of surgery at Northwestern, and then he came to Duke, and I was amazingly fortunate to do work with him. He helped me do research in the UK and in Scotland and also in South Africa. So he was a wonderful inspiration for me. And I really hope many of our colleagues today are putting that level of influence that they can have on this next generation.
I'll have to say that urologists have the best jokes.
Yeah, always.
Now, they may not be the most, kosher jokes, so you have to be careful when you say them, but it's definitely the funniest, the funniest jokes.
Yeah, they're funny and oftentimes inappropriate.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when you started doing practice, though, you have a unique set of practice. Obviously, I know a lot about it, but probably a lot of listeners don't. How did you get from point A to point B? And tell us about the setting of your practice, because you have certain resources that I presume the majority of urology practices don't have.
Mm-hmm. Well, I finished my training in 1990, and if you go back historically, it was quite cynical and pessimistic, what some would describe as nihilistic for our prostate cancer patients, bladder and kidney cancer patients. I mean, we had pretty much very little bit. And it was very daunting to me, this level of despondency, especially in prostate cancer, once you failed testosterone suppression and androgen deprivation therapy. And of course, this was pre-internet. And I started talking to folks at meetings and realizing that there was, the proverbial massive unmet need to help patients. And I would talk to medical affairs and the leadership at various, biopharma companies, academic leadership too, which in urology was very surgically focused at that time. But no one was really paying attention to our patients who had metastatic disease. And the trials were very focused at that time only in our tertiary academic centers. And I had so many of these patients. But where I was in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, is very far away from an academic center. And so I really started to recognize that it was important to enroll patients in studies. I think about this great quote from Halstead, who said, we should all be physician scientists, and then concomitantly that the wards or the clinics are research labs of the highest order, and I think that just really resonated to me, and to bring clinical research into truly into the clinic, and then ultimately that to have enough of a variety of research studies so that I could pull together that every patient became accessible to a clinical study, particularly in cancer. And in the early days, I had to, convince my partners, who were frankly not particularly happy with what I was doing. They thought it would be, I should just be leaving that to tertiary centers, but honestly, they really weren't doing the level of accrual. And I was very fortunate to have a healthcare provider team, nurses in particular, and some administrators who kind of saw the reasoning for why I wanted to do this, to advance healthcare, to advance opportunities for patients in my community that couldn't go to a tertiary academic center. And then by extension to, and promote that education, not just regionally, but nationally, and I think internationally.
And then as a urologist, though, when you're talking about GU oncology, bladder, kidney, and prostate, most often you're seeing patients presumably in localized disease, unless you have metastatic disease and you're asked to biopsy something. So were your trials originally or initially when you started focused on early stage diseases? And is that how you started?
I really sort of did my pioneering work with androgen deprivation therapies, where we were going from the 1-month formulations to the 3, to the 4, to the 6, and the 12-month. And so realistically, most of these patients had metastatic disease. And then over time, if you fast forward with the development of docetaxel in 2004, great studies by Petrolak and Tanek, until 2010 with Sipuleucel T. And then from 2010 to now, we go from, those another 10 life-prolonging therapies. And they all start, as you know, Chadi, because you've done this work, in the sickest patients. And it's typically for prostate, it's a binary endpoint, it's survival or not. And we've made great progress working with FDA to look at some other endpoints such as MFS. And ultimately, when we find a therapy, whether it's another taxane, a PARP inhibitor, all of the wonderful advances in androgen receptor pathway drugs, and now, of course, the PSMA RLTs, it allows us to start moving more proximally. So it's been, really wonderful in that regard.
And then basically you were approached by pharmaceutical companies to do some of the pharma-sponsored trials. Were you also involved in some of the cooperative group studies as well, and some of investigator-initiated studies, multi-center studies?
Yeah, absolutely. So I personally have done about a half a dozen where I PI'd IITs. I've been involved in other of my friends' IITs. We've done cooperative group, NIH, NCI trial sponsored studies. But honestly, the vast majority of the trials that we've done, and I think we're now up to about 400, if not more, have been through biopharma. I mean, bottom line is they have their resources. And, you know, being by myself, I don't have the luxury of having a large academic institution to give me that type of grant support within the organization. I don't have endowments and fellowships that I can rely on. So as everybody knows, trials are expensive. And, you know, I went from having only an LPN helping me to now having 18 full-time equivalent colleagues who only do research. And that's a combination of RNs, LPNs, and administrators. So, you know, the business of running a research organization is not only to do what's in the best interest of patients, but also you have to remain economically viable, as all institutions do.
And then, I mean, to do that, obviously you had to hire staff, and you've grown significantly. Did you have to cut on surgery? Like, I mean, did you have to actually, were you doing this in addition to surgery, or you would take 2 days a week where you don't, how would that affect your surgical schedule?
Yeah, you know, it was a lot of time and energy and effort. You know, it's a funny thing. I live in Myrtle Beach and people say to me, oh, you must golf all the time. And I don't. I pretty much gave up golf about 10 years ago. I only have one child. I have a remarkably supportive wife. I enjoy the work of what I do. So they're long days and weekends, but it's my passion and I enjoy it. I don't have a large amount of family responsibility. You know, unfortunately, my parents are deceased a long time. And so for me, I think those are legitimate reasons why many of our colleagues, whether they have a passion for a sport or, I mean, I love skiing, but I don't do that on a regular basis living in Myrtle Beach. And so, you know, it allowed me to give up a lot of my, you know, weeknights and weekends, but I don't look at it as a sacrifice. It's really what I've enjoyed doing. So that's probably why I've been able to be as productive.
And then, Neal, I mean, as you were doing these trials, initially started with the androgen deprivation therapy, and you probably started doing some studies with kidneys and bladder as well, with some of this new, originally TKIs and something like that.
Yeah, I got, with the moment the TKIs kind of came out, I started using, sorafenib and sutinib, helped bring sutinib, it's easier to say Sutent, went to the ODAC for them, immediately got involved in checkpoint inhibitor therapy, started using them in 2016 in bladder and then in kidney. I mean, we give ipi-nivo combinations here, just did trials with ipi-nivo and cabozantinib. And then back in 2016, also got very involved in recognizing the importance of genomic profiling. So we've been doing NGS. I work with all the different companies, both somatic and germline. And for me, I mean, I just recognize that this is not a question of if you were going to do it, but it was when. And so I realized that how important this was. And I really tried over these years and continue to do so now to educate my urology colleagues who want to do this, how important it is. I've never felt that this was should be an internecine warfare amongst the specialties.
Well, let's talk about that. Let's talk about that, because you're doing a lot of these systemic therapies, and I think there's, whether it's right or wrong, but there's a sense that systemic therapy that is not related to surgery and using the knife sits in the medical oncology world, and conflict of interest. I'm a medical oncologist, but I've told you I'm a big admirer of what you've accomplished, but needless to say, it's not commonly seen in the urology world. So how does this work when you say, I'm going to give systemic therapy for kidney cancer with the TKIs, I'm going to give the docetaxel of chemotherapy? I mean, you are not a trained medical oncologist or board certified medical oncologist. So help us understand the kind of setup you need to do to be able to deliver these systemic therapies safely to the patients.
Yeah, that's a very fair and an important question. So for me, if I were practicing adjacent to a GU medical oncologist who was doing this and was passionate about it, I don't think my my career would have developed. But my medical oncologist, which I think is very true of many in busy community medical oncology communities, they're not seeing a lot of bladder or kidney cancer, and they're treating lots of breast cancer and lung cancer and colorectal cancer, blood-based cancers. And in particularly in my community, none of the medical oncologists were doing clinical studies. None. They were too busy, and they're great people, highly talented, highly dedicated, but that it just wasn't of interest to them. So I saw that that was a need for the community, and it was certainly a keen interest of mine. I personally believe that when a new therapy is getting developed, that, you know, if you have a physician, a medical degree, and you are, you know, dedicated to it, and you can do it. Now, I'm completely against someone who looks at this as a dalliance, or that's grossly inappropriate. If you can work well with your medical oncologist, your radiation oncologist, your nuclear medicine radiologist, your pathologist, and do it in a multidisciplinary way, that is the best way to do it, for sure, hands down, the classic academic model. But you know, we live in a world now where there's a true person power shortage. The average medical oncologist in the US and urologist, I think, is now 55 years old. And we have an explosion of the geriatric population, you know, this graying of the world theme, or what some call the silver tsunami. So, and we also have more clinical trials than we sometimes have patients. So it just seemed absolutely, completely in keeping with what I've been trying to do. If you have a wonderful GU medical oncologist in your catchment area, then work with that person. I would have loved nothing more, but I just didn't have it, nor do I really even have it today. I'm still the only one in this area, you know, 4 hours away from Duke or 2.5 hours from MUSC, where clinical trials are even being contemplated.
How about the non-clinical trial patients? I know that you enroll a lot to clinical trial patients, and the numbers speak for themselves in terms of the number of studies as well as the number of patients enrolled. But it's fair to say that not all patients get into clinical trials. So for the standard of care patients, are you giving these patients docetaxel in the office for prostate cancer, or cabazitaxel and things like that, if they are routine clinical care?
I am. I give carbo and cabazi, carbo and dosi in my patients who are poorly differentiated disease. The only thing I don't give, frankly, is cisplatin. I refer that to my medical oncology colleagues. But short of that, I pretty much will give everything. I often or regularly encourage patients to get second opinions, not only with my joining community medical oncologists, but sending them off to my good friends and colleagues at Duke, for example, Andy Armstrong and Dan George. I'm always more than happy, or to send patients to Memorial Sloan Kettering or Hopkins, where I know my friends and colleagues there too. And if the last thing in the world I would ever do was hold someone back from getting a second, third, or fourth opinion. But to the basis of, you know, your question is, you know, when these drugs came out, I spent a lot of time not only just learning about it, but of course going to meetings and going to educational seminars and having already used them in clinical trials. So I never take on anything unless I feel very confident. I have separate infusion nurses for my clinic and separate infusion nurses in research, and I send them regularly to educational courses such as ONS or SUNA, and some, you know, biopharma supported courses as well.
So these are oncology trained nurses that are delivering. And then do you have advanced practice providers or medical oncologists employed in your practice to supervise or deliver, or there is no medical oncologist in the practice?
So our group currently is about 14 physicians, and we have 14 advanced practice providers, combination of NPs and PAs. I have had for the last 6 years a full-time NP who has worked with me in addition to other key members of my team, RNs, LPNs, scribes, medical assistants. I was just recently at a meeting of put on by Specialty Network, and this exact question came up. What's happened over time is the 1, 2, 3 person practice is dissipating, is becoming anachronistic in urology and medical oncology, and frankly, most specialties. Aggregation is the key for economies of scale. And a big question that was asked at this meeting was, okay, these typical 30, 40, 20 person urology practices, they're all developing, or most are developing, advanced prostate cancer clinics of excellence, and now advanced bladder cancer clinics of excellence and advanced kidney cancer clinics of excellence. So will it be the uro-oncologist, or should they bring in a medical oncologist? I am a big proponent. If you want to bring in a medical oncologist and you have the volume, that's a great option. And I think we're seeing more and more of that. I'm aware of at least 6 or 7 groups that have done that. I think you'll see more do that. But I also think that there are going to be educational opportunities for the right uro-oncologist who may be fellowship trained, who is not necessarily wedded to only doing the surgical oncology. Honestly, I think it's very difficult to be very busy doing the surgical major extirpative procedures and then coming back to clinic and taking care of complicated patients with metastatic disease.
So, I mean, just in terms of follow-up, you have the infusion center, and there's a system or a process by which these patients are followed for side effects and adverse events and things like that. But the management is you and the advanced practice providers, and there is no actual medical oncologist employed currently. You mentioned something about other urology practices. To me, your setup is very unique. I haven't seen a lot of setups like this. Are you seeing more in the US urology practices venturing into this? That's the first part of my question. And the second part, do you do radiation therapy as well in your practice? And are you seeing the same for urology practices elsewhere?
So I'll take the first part, the radiation oncology. So we're subsumed under the larger umbrella of Genesis Care. And we have 3 radiation oncologists who I work, wonderfully with. I'm on speed dial, they're on speed dial. So they deliver the radiation oncology services, inclusive of radiation, IMRT, IGRT, hypofractionation, but all SBRT, but also the theranostics. So I'm pretty confident no community urology site enrolled more patients in Vision trial that led to the approval of Pluvicto than our site. But it was the radiation oncologists who have the requirement for having the radioactivity materials license to deliver the beta particle that is lutetium. We were the first site in the United States to deliver radium-223. My radiation oncologist, but it was my patient back when the Alsimca trial led to the approval of radium-223. We gave the first dose in the US post-approval, and we're proud of that. We gave the first dose of Sipuleucel-T east of the Mississippi when that got approved. And so it's a combination of, we work very well with our radiation oncologists. Now, getting back to that model I think we're going to see more and more medical oncologists going into larger urology practices because the urology practices are getting bigger and bigger. The average size urology practice now, what goes into the organization LUGPA, the Large Urology Group Practice Association, which I'm super honored and proud to have been one of the founding members, like 17, 18 years ago. Now our average size group, I think, is around 28, 30 physicians. Although we accept anyone who's a practicing urologist now in the United States. But this notion around opening up a solo practice, 1, 2, 3 person, I think is is not long for the future because of scale, the complexity of healthcare, the need for size, the need for competent, sophisticated administrative leadership, and just let's face it, it's all gotten so much more complicated. So I think we're going to see more and more medical oncologists going into the large urology group on a full-time basis.
Do you sense, I mean, when you talk to people and meet people on the travel circle, do you sense that medical oncologists are a little bit upset with you a little bit, and like, how are you giving chemotherapy? I mean, I'm the one who should be giving chemotherapy. Or, I mean, like, what's your sense of your interaction with medical oncology?
Yeah, that's a fair question. Honestly, I'm so honored to be part of organizations like the Advanced Prostate Cancer Consensus Conference, which is started by two remarkably talented medical oncologists from Switzerland, Silke Gillison and Aurelius Omelin. I love working with my colleagues in academic GU medical oncology. I think my role has been somewhat of very different and an outlier and unique. And again, I would say as long as the patient is getting excellence in care by someone who can deliver it well, that's the most important thing. My medical oncology colleagues are all incredibly busy. I mean, the medical oncologists in my own community and everywhere else I go they're not lacking patients, and they're very, very busy. And so I think, 20 years ago, there may have been more of this specialty internecine rivalry. I think today everyone's so darn busy. As long as patients are getting good care, I think it's definitely generational. I think some of the older generations, I even think rad oncs versus urologic surgeons from 20 years ago, 30 years ago to today have a much more collegial relationship. And I think the same is true with medical oncology.
So I want to pivot a little bit into some of the research studies, and I want to use an example of a research study that was recently published in JAMA Oncology. And I bring this up because it did stir a little bit of trouble on social media. Not to say that, I mean, social media is trouble, as you know, Neal. I don't see you very active on Twitter. I need to find your handle. But trust me, you're not missing much by not being on Twitter very actively. But the trial I want to bring up is the ENACT trial. And, I think that there was a lot of back and forth and all of these things. So I want to, now that everybody knows about your setting, everybody knows about the breadth and depth of research you've been doing for many years and understands where you're coming from, I think it's a reasonable opportunity for us to move into using this as an example of how a trial comes into your office, your practice, you look at it, you open it, you enroll to it, you get published. So how did this trial come about? When did this come about, and how long ago? And then take us through the process of the study from the first time you were approached about it until it opened, enrolled, and then published. And then we'll talk about the controversy.
Sure. So, I think, I think about that wonderful commencement speech that Steve Jobs gave at Stanford. I think it's been downloaded millions of times. And one of the things he said, and it was nice for me to hear it, was, stay hungry and stay foolish. Those are two simple comments he made. And I think I interpret the hungry as, we need to continue to be challenging ourselves all the time, especially as physician scientists. One of the things that was why I really took a tremendous interest in research is I was doing all these prostatectomies back in the 90s and even in the early 2000s. And I'd get back the final pathology and it was, Gleason 6, 10% of the specimen in a 60-year-old man. And I was like, oh my gosh, please be potent and please be continent. and I started to realize, that, we were over treating, and as were many. This was not a Neal Shore unique thing, but yet there was a lack of education on active surveillance and the importance of that. And then if you fast forward now, we're doing better in terms of our active surveillance adoption, but we still are not anywhere near where we should be. So I started thinking, well, what are the reasons? And it's complicated, and part of it's PSA kinetics, and part of it's education to not only patients, but also to providers. So I've been involved in numerous other active surveillance type comparator studies or augmented studies to see, can we keep patients avoiding unnecessary surgical extirpation, unnecessary radiation, even unnecessary focal therapies? Are there ways that we can administer a treatment that would keep them from progressing histopathologically on a subsequent biopsy, keep them with greater fidelity to a surveillance? Not only would save them from the morbidity of interventional treatment, certainly be potentially economically helpful. Now, I'm not saying that, and I never did say, nor did any of my co-authors, nor did the folks from Estella say this was a registrational study. Far from it. We looked at previous study with, for example, dutasteride that was investigated only in patients with grade group 1 disease to see what the impact would be on using dutasteride. And that paper was, there were positive results from that. It was published in Lancet Oncology. So we said, well, no one had looked at an approved oncolytic agent, enzalutamide, and we took a patient population of not just grade group 1, but also grade group 2 to see, could we help these patients stay on an active surveillance path, but also what would be the result with biopsying them, and what would, of course, the results of their PSAs? Pretty obvious that their PSAs would come down. We expected that there would be side effects that were very well known to enzalutamide. I'm quite frankly very proud of the fact that I've been involved in the AFFIRM and the Terrain and the Strive and the Prosper and the Arches trials. I've been involved in all of those, which ultimately led to an advancement of enzalutamide throughout that entire spectrum. So for me, it was logical that you would say, well, okay, we've seen benefits there, MCSPC, NMCRPC, MCRPC, pre-chemo, post-chemo. Is there a role in this population? It's controversial, I understand it. And I think a lot of the opprobrium that I received, I shouldn't say I, but myself and my co-authors, was, oh my gosh, wasn't this a foregone conclusion? Well, honestly, nobody had looked at an AR pathway inhibitor drug in this patient population until we did. And yes, there were some side effects, none of them unexpected. Did we also see a 3 times odds ratio improvement in negative biopsy compared to the surveillance arm? We did. Did we see decreases in PSA? We only gave the drug for a year. Many, I think, in the Twitterverse were like, I don't want to denigrate people who like to go on social media. That it is what it is. It's not going back into the bottle. But this was brought in front of IRBs. There were 63 sites in Canada and the US that did this. And I found it rather kind of to me, it was emblematic of what, Twitter brings, is people just spouting off because they can and they want to. And that's okay. I believe in free speech. But, we have the data. Now, looking at the data and looking at the full dose that we gave, I think there's a lot of opportunity to think about other studies, whether you reduce the dose, whether you change the trial schedule, whether you look at other ARPIs. And I'm now working with another company where we have a pellet to implant directly into the prostate that is not absorbed systemically. So think about that, where you could give an AR pathway inhibitor drug directly into the prostate and avoid systemic toxicity. So, no study is perfect, but I believe, as I go back to the earlier part of our conversation, I believe we're all physician scientists, and we should welcome the information and debate it. But I sometimes think, the some of the adjectives and the vitriol is just really more consistent with what Twitter tends to be, and that's fine. But I think we have some of our colleagues who are making a career of that, and that's all right too. But I think I'm a little bit old school. I like to look at the data, and we can debate it and think about how we can make it better.
So very well put, Neal. I appreciate you obviously talking about this, and I know it's not easy to come obviously on any platform and discuss a trial that has been labeled as controversial. To go back to when the trial was first initiated, the plan was, we know that these folks are low risk, so they are on active surveillance. So you wanted to randomize these patients to either active surveillance or active surveillance plus enzalutamide, with the idea of seeing whether enzalutamide improves negative biopsies. I think what have you seen? I mean, I think folks spoke about that giving 1 year of therapy of this drug to a low-risk patient could add adverse events, financial toxicity, and you're taking a patient population that requires no therapy and just subjecting them to additional therapy that might not be warranted. That, I believe, that is what I have seen. I did not engage personally in the debate. I saw what, I could see where this is coming from, because these patients in real life, you're just going to monitor, and they may never require any therapy, and a negative biopsy does not necessarily correlate with living longer, all of that stuff, the endpoints and what we talked about. So when you first opened that trial, your aim was that you can improve the outcomes of these patients who already had a favorable outcome. That's where people are struggling with, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. So I can't, reveal the data, but we have an abstract that was accepted at ESMO for 2022 in Paris, where we looked at specific subtypes using Decipher. And it's remarkably powerful what we described as to who would respond particularly strongly, powerfully with the use of enzalutamide. Great work done by Ashley Ross and Ted Schaefer and a team of others as well. So that abstract has now been accepted to ESMO 2023. And, this was never designed ENACT as a registrational study. So the notion around the cost is actually makes no sense, frankly. This was just using a highly active first androgen receptor pathway inhibitors, came right after abiraterone. And so, you don't know what you don't know until you do the studies. I've heard some argue, well, just gosh, everybody should just, be better at their active surveillance. I can't argue with that. Sure, I'm a huge proponent of active surveillance. I'm not starting on any of my AS patients on enzalutamide today. No, I would not. This was a scientific phase 2 study done with an incredible amount of rigor, and we presented the results. So the economics is really an immaterial discussion, because no one's moving forward right now with a pathway for regulatory approval. So
I think there is a sense, though, and again, I don't know how people will react to this. There was a sense that some folks in the real world may use this trial as an excuse to prescribe the therapy. You probably won't, because this is what you do every day. You're a thought leader in the field of GU oncology. But for the general oncologist out there who does not see enough prostate cancer to make that decision, they might see this and say, okay, well, I'm going to see my patient, I'll just dispense enzalutamide, and sometimes it gets reimbursed, sometimes it may not, but that's really where the fear comes from.
Well, that would be a huge mistake. And it's not probably, I definitely would not do that in an active surveillance patient unless this was part of a clinical study. So I would 100% admonish anybody to please do not do that, nor would I do any other androgen receptor pathway drug. I recognize that some people think that, they do off-label prescribing. I personally am not a big proponent of that. That's why I do clinical trials. You put the data out there, you present. JAM Oncology is an extremely reputable and thoughtful publication with great reviewers. If our clinicians are going to, be irresponsible, well, then shame on them. But I don't think that's enough of a reason to say don't do the studies and don't have the debate and don't learn from it and design future studies that may have an even better benefit with less toxicity and maybe better, more interesting modes of delivery.
What has been your, and I agree on JAMA Oncology. I sit on the editorial board, so I concur with you. In fact, we're taping this on July 18, where we just have had our editorial board meeting. What has been your personal experience with that reaction? I think we all react differently to social media, but we're also humans. And I think some of these reactions do affect us personally, psychologically, emotionally, whatever you want to call it. I don't know, have you seen people reaching out to you and being angry? Have you had scenarios where people were upset? Are there letters to the editors being written that you need to respond to? What has been just your collective experience with this? And then were you really surprised with the reaction? Because the reason I ask this, Neal, sometimes when you write an opinion piece, let's say I'm writing an opinion piece and I know it's my opinion, and let's say I'm being a provocateur in my opinion, I may expect a backlash and maybe I'll feed off it because I knew why I wrote the opinion. But this was not an opinion piece. This was a randomized phase 2 trial that you actually wrote, peer-reviewed, published in a peer-reviewed journal that is an impact factor over 30. You must have gotten a little bit surprised with this. Take me through what you went through when this came to press and tell us what happened.
No, I appreciate that. Yes, I don't tweet, and I don't spend much time at all on Twitter, almost no time. I only got a Facebook page when my son was a young teenager, so I could see what he was doing, and now he's not even on Facebook. I don't go on Instagram. I have a hard enough time just keeping my inbox, manageable. That's the truth. But one of my he's one of my partners. He's young. He's a full partner. He does all our surgical oncology. He said, Neal, you got to go on Twitter, man. It's blowing up. I was like, I didn't even know. I think I have a Twitter handle, but I didn't even know how to get on. So I got on. I started looking at this stuff. I was like, holy smokes! And most of the people I didn't even know. A few of them I did. And then I just did an interview for an article that's coming out. And the author is a very thoughtful guy. He's a prostate cancer survivor. And he told me some of the quotes from some of our colleagues who I know very well. And I won't name their names, but one of them said, this study was unethical. A medical oncologist. She said, this is unethical. And then another prominent uro-oncologist said this was a bogus design. And I was like, it's so interesting how we've evolved, or what some might call devolved, in our dialogue and our choice of words. And I have to say, to be very honest, I was disappointed when I saw some of the colleagues who I really know, because I think I would be hard pressed to use words like that, but that's just really kind of where our culture has evolved or devolved to, depending upon your perspective. I'm proud of the work that we did in this trial. I'm proud of all the co-authors. I'm proud of the patients. you only learn when you do studies like this, and you try to design a better trial. And that's how we make advances. My whole North Star is, where will patients benefit? And it's okay to have debate, but yeah, I would be disingenuous if I didn't say I was, somewhat shocked that as some of the Twitter response, most of the folks I don't even know, and I don't even know what type of experiences they've had in doing studies, and that's fine. I do, like I said earlier, look, free speech is a wonderful thing. You have to take it in stride.
Yeah, it's. Are you going to be more on Twitter now after you?
No,
you-
I like I said, Chad, I just went away for vacation. And even when I go away, I just can't. I'm never. You'll never see me put one of these things in my response. I'm away. Don't. I'll call you in 2 weeks. I'm a slave to it. I check it every day, because I have to keep it manageable. But I'm not getting on. I don't have no plans to get onto Twitter.
Well, you can always get on. I'll manage your account, but I'm not responsible. So you're gonna get. Hey, this has been really great, and I know we have only just a few minutes left, but are you, some of the discourse usually for articles like this are handled with letters to the editors to the journal, and then you have to respond. I don't know when the article came out, but are you getting some letters to the editors and you're being asked to respond to it, or it's just too short? Some depends on, I forgot actually.
Yeah. No, I haven't had any sent to me for asking for a response from JAMA Oncology.
Yeah, and there was an editorial written in the journal pertaining to the article, I believe, at the time of publication.
Susan Hallaby, and she's fabulous. I think she gave a very, thoughtful, mature, as she always is. I mean, she's brilliant, and I thought it was very, appropriate, measured, and yeah. It was very good.
So you just came back from safari. Where are you heading next?
Right where I'm heading next is to just continue to dig out from my clinic work for the last 2 weeks. But next, I would say, I'll be sticking around this summer, and next I'm heading to Paris for ESMO 2022.
Well, I will be seeing you there. I'm going to be looking forward to seeing the additional data that you mentioned to us on this podcast. And I look forward to seeing you at ESMO in Paris. Neal, it's been such a pleasure to connect with you, and really appreciate you coming on the podcast. I know how crazy your schedule is. Anything else I should have asked you I may have forgotten? Anything? I mean, this podcast is going to be on Twitter, maybe LinkedIn, on YouTube. You're going to be famous after this. I don't know if you know this. Not that you're not famous already.
I probably said enough to already get myself into trouble. I better quit while I'm ahead. Or I don't even know that I better just quit and not dig myself a deeper hole.
Well, Neal, thank you so much for being with me today. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.